5 weeks left in this NFL season. We have several players trying to put their stamp on this year's MVP trophy. Kyle Ledbetter, you believe that it is going to one man. What is your prediction for MVP this season?
As of right now, that one man who is the front runner for NFL MVP is Dak Prescott. It's Dak Prescott, and I know that's kind of funny to think about because the Dallas Cowboys are the Dallas Cowboys. I don't believe they've had an MVP since 1994, if I remember correctly, with Emmitt Smith winning MVP. So, yeah, I think it's Dak Prescott, man. Dak Prescott has put together an incredible season so far. And it's so weird that that's happened, right? Because they got rid of Kellen Moore and brought in Brian Schottenheimer, which is hilarious. He was the take away Russ's ability to cook guy in Seattle. He was with the Jaguars with, I think, Gus Bradley or something like that. Like, Brian Schottenheimer has become like a punchline of being conservative offensive play caller. I mean, he's not even really calling the plays. Mike McCarthy is doing more of the play calling duty throughout the season. And taking away Dak's ability to throw the ball down the field has actually made Dak into an MVP caliber player because of his running ability, because he's gotten lucky on some of the turnovers, but his middle of the field ability has been impeccable. And those receivers that I thought were going to be terrible at the start of the season have actually turned out to be great weapons for the Dallas Cowboys. I thought it was a mistake letting Noah Brown and Dalton Schultz leave in free agency and replacing him with the reject of Brandon Cooks. But Cooks has come in, and when he's been healthy, he's been fantastic this season. Jake Ferguson as a tight end has stepped up and looked fantastic for the Cowboys. Dak Prescott, since getting the break speed off him by the San Francisco 49ers, has 16 touchdowns, 1 interception. The Cowboys have won basically every game that they have played, and he has been the best quarterback in the NFL. Without a question, he was the offensive player of the month in November. And as it stands right now, in a season that will go down as one of the weakest MVP winners of the last 10 years, Dak Prescott is the MVP.
I just have one question. Are you out of your mind? Come on. Dak winning MVP, Dakota Prescott. Someone named Dakota winning the MVP. Come on. Ridiculous.
He's been incredible. He has been absolutely incredible this season. And it wouldn't just be the whole, the Cowboys fan pushing the narrative of Dak. No, nobody has claimed the MVP this year. Nobody in the league has run away with the MVP. Patrick Mahomes threw a dumb interception to lose against the Packers. That never happens to Patrick Mahomes. In a season where no one has jumped out and grabbed the MVP and ran with it like Mahomes did last year, like Aaron Rodgers did in 20 and 21. Todd Gurley should have had in 2018. But besides the point, like, no one has jumped out and grabbed it. And because it's just kind of sitting out there, Dak Prescott has come in and taken charge and established himself as the front runner for the MVP with 16 touchdowns, 1 interception, and a passer rating over 110 over a not so insignificant sample size of 6 games.
No one has grabbed the MVP. Brock Purdy grabbed the MVP, I think, at this current moment in time. As it currently stands, I've heard Chris Broussard throw out this term quite a few times on The Odd Couple, but the Dallas Cowboys really have beaten up on tomato cans. The Carolina Panthers, the New York Giants, all these scrubs that the Cowboys have risen to the top point differential in the league with are just not going to be there whenever January football rolls around. And I think Dak inflating his numbers by beating up on these teams is honestly irrelevant, because I judge you by whenever you play the cream of the crop. And Dak threw multiple interceptions in that game against the 49ers. He could have probably been picked off several more times in that game. He looked terrible. Meanwhile, Brock Purdy, in 2 games against the Dallas Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles, he's thrown 70% completion percentage and 8 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. Mr. Relevant is very relevant in this year's MVP conversation, just based off what he's done against the best teams in the league. And yeah, they had that 3-game stretch was pretty ugly, but since the bye week, he's had a literal perfect passer rating against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He had that 1 game against the Cardinals where he had 1 incompletion. He just keeps finding new, interesting ways to just put himself into this MVP conversation. And yes, everyone will say he's a product of the cast of talent around him, but I have never seen a quarterback expertly distribute the ball like he does. He just puts the ball always in the right spot. And I think just based off the head-to-head, And based off the head-to-head of the Eagles beating the Cowboys, we'll see if that still stands after week 14. I think that Brock Purdy is currently ahead of Dak at this moment.
I will not dispute the Brock Purdy MVP point, because Brock Purdy very much deserves to be second place in this MVP conversation. It realistically is those two. Patrick Mahomes has the statistical case for it. I don't think they'll give it to him in a year where Kansas City is going to finish with its worst record in the Mahomes era. Therefore, I think by proxy, they're not going to consider him as an MVP finalist, even though his numbers bear out that he's an MVP finalist, for the same reason Josh Allen isn't. Like, Josh Allen's third in QBR this year behind Dak and Brock Purdy, but they're probably not going to give it to Josh Allen because the Buffalo Bills have found ways to piss away all these games and might end up missing the playoffs. So by proxy, I think that's fair. Like, we've decided this is the exit ramp of, like, if you don't win enough games, you cannot win MVP and all that stuff. And it's fair that Dak Prescott's worst game of the season, and really his only bad game of the season. I mean, I'm looking at the stats for Dak Prescott all year. The only game this year where he had a below average NFL passer rating, well, really he had two. He had one against the Vikings where he had an 81, which is slightly below average, but his only bad game this year was against the 49ers. Every other game he's been an above average to great NFL quarterback. And Brock Purdy's one bad game happened to be against the Cleveland Browns, and that stinks for him. His one bad game happened to come against Cleveland. Meanwhile, Dak's one bad game came on primetime against the San Francisco 49ers. And meanwhile, you know, Brock Purdy's game, most people didn't have that as their national game of the week. So that'll work in favor of Brock over Dak because of the head-to-head. But I think that Dak Prescott, look, you talked about them beating up on terrible teams. In what world did the Philadelphia Eagles become a bad team? Because in that game, Dak Prescott had 374 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 0 INTs, and a passer rating of 115.2. I'm not sure when the Los Angeles Rams became a bad team. I know their defense is their shortcoming, of course, but the Rams are a 6-6 team where Dak Prescott completed 80% of his passes for 304 yards, 4 touchdowns, an interception, and a 133.7 passer rating. I don't know when the Seattle Seahawks, the defense everyone was gawking over at the start of the season, became a bad team, because the Seahawks game, Dak completed over 70% of his passes for 300 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 116 passer rating. Like, he has played some bad teams, understandably, but against the good teams he's played, he's also been an MVP level quarterback.
At this point, it does feel like it is between Brock Purdy and Dak Prescott, because Dak will have the statistical case. But I'm also thinking about, as you mentioned, going back to the win-loss records and everything. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers the 1 seed both years that he won the MVP? Given that's the case, 13-3 both seasons. If the Cowboys were to happen to fall to the wild card behind both the Eagles and Cowboys, I think it would be hard to make a case that he's above those quarterbacks, especially if, let's say, the Niners never lose another game the rest of the season and Purdy just continues to put up the numbers that he's putting up, right? Because he's actually on pace to break Jeff Garcia's franchise passing record this season. He's on pace to match Steve Young's 49ers all-time passing touchdowns mark of 36. If he hits both those marks for the most storied quarterback franchise, or one of the most storied quarterback franchises in the National Football League, then it's going to be a hard case for Dak Prescott to overwhelm, because again, the narrative's out there just beating up on these weaker teams, these middling teams. And obviously the Cowboys are a little bit of a different kind of offense, right? They're more pass happy. So they're, of course, going to put up more gaudy numbers in terms of the passing numbers. But I think Brock Purdy's like efficiency is where I think I really give him like the edge, just like everything he's doing. And then he's leading the league in like air yards, his yards per attempt. He's just doing everything at such a phenomenal pace. You mentioned they're telling Dak literally to not throw the ball deep. Purdy's airing it out. Like, he had that 77-yarder to Ayuk recently, the 66-yarder to Kittle, the 44-yard touchdown in quadruple coverage against the Seattle Seahawks on Thursday night. Every time we talk about an MVP or a Heisman, these top tier individual awards like in football, we always like say, okay, that's the Heisman moment, right? Like Bryce Young against Texas last year, whenever he had that incredible escape from the pocket to throw the ball and find a guy and set them up for the game-winning field goal, I believe. That was like his Heisman moment. Brock Purdy, the fact that he's been able to stunt on both the Cowboys and Eagles, that's his MVP moment. Like, if there's like 2 examples I could point to, and I don't think Dak is really going to have like those shining examples to point to. You mentioned, okay, putting up 80% completion percentage against the Rams. Neat. If they happen to go in and beat the Eagles this week and Dak really outshines the Eagles, maybe. But if they ultimately lose the division, I think that his team's going to work against him in that respect, because again, the numbers are going to be comparable, but the team performance won't be.
I think that is a fair point. And my argument is not we should look past the Dak Prescott playing like crap against the San Francisco 49ers game as his one bad game. The flip side to that, and why hopefully the 50 people who are voting will see through the air on the bullshit around the narratives and the Cowboys playing the easy opponents and stuff like that. The point that I would make to that is, like, we shouldn't also look past how bad Brock Purdy played in that 3-game stretch where Trent Williams was hurt and Brock Purdy may or may not have been concussed. Like, Brock Purdy had the worst game of his season against Cleveland, potentially cost them the game in that Cleveland game. When he was trying to lead a comeback against the Vikings, he threw 2 interceptions, one of which was his fault, one of which wasn't, but he threw 2 interceptions at the end of that game in crunch time to seal the loss against Minnesota.
Yeah, the Bengals game, like, it was a rough fourth quarter for him. Admittedly, I still say that the Bengals player on this first interception made a great play. The second interception was pretty bad, and I will give that. But, obviously Dak is nothing above bad interceptions himself. I just think that you're judged in MVP seasons more so by the big games, the games that matter in terms of playoff seeding and who's going to ultimately get that bye week, win their division, win your conference. And I think when you're going against a head-to-head, because the fact that the Eagles, Niners, and Cowboys will have all played each other, I think is a unique dynamic in this conversation, because we literally seen these two teams, as Hassan Reddick put it, lace that shit up and play. The Niners have laced that shit up and play, and they beat the brakes off both the Cowboys and the Eagles, and Brock Purdy has been right at the center of that action because, again, yes, he distributes. Yes, he's a point guard, but would we take away any MVPs from Magic Johnson? No. He may be a product of the system, but he damn well makes the system great. I saw someone use the soundbite of James Harden saying, "I'm not a system player, I am the system." Brock Purdy has really made this system his own, and he's excelled within it, and I think that deserves a lot of credit.
Yes, and it's why I'm not, if this is going to turn into a Dak Prescott versus Brock Purdy debate, which it's not, I think Brock is right there with him. It's a deadlocked tie right now on the statistics, basically. Brock Purdy should not be punished for playing for a really, really good team.
Want a fun stat?
Throw it at me.
Last year's MVP, of course, Patrick Mahomes. We know how great of player he is, right? Versus Brock Purdy this year. So obviously Brock Purdy, he's judged harshly because yards after catch. And hey, Debo made 2 outstanding yards after the catch touchdowns yesterday. No disputing that at all, right? Well, in his MVP season, Patrick Mahomes, his yards after the catch, 54% of his total yards. Brock Purdy, his yards after the catch this season, 48%. It's clearly not all yards after the catch. And I think more people have to start recognizing that, because I feel like people, like, they look at Purdy's box score and they don't really do the work of watching him play. And thankfully he's been on prime time enough times at this point to where people can actually watch his game and start to appreciate a little bit more what he does, because I think a lot of people think he's just check down Charlie. But again, the fact that he's among the league leaders in yards per attempt and air yards should tell you a lot. He's a playmaker. He's willing to outplay the system at times. And that says a lot when you have such a great play caller like Kyle Shanahan, that you're able to play outside the system. And sometimes Kyle Shanahan even has to say, yeah, I think some of the things he does are some of the worst mistakes I've ever seen, but God damn it, I love it when he throws touchdowns for me like he did in the Jacksonville game.
He's had a couple of those bullshit touchdowns this year that have worked in his favor, which, regardless of whether you take the basic quarterback stats or whether you take the eye test or whether you take the nerd stats, pretty much all of them will tell you it's Dak Prescott and Brock Purdy are neck and neck right now. Because if you take away Brock Purdy's worst 2 games of the season, which was the Browns game and the Vikings game, we'll take away those 2.
Put the Bengals game, I think, because he was actually, I want to say in the Vikings game, he threw for the most yards in his career at that point.
I think he might have outdid himself in that Bengals game because he was throwing the ball a lot, but points still standing. So if you take away the Bengals game and the Browns game from Brock Purdy, and you take away the Niners game from Dak Prescott at this point in the season would have, rushing and passing combined, he would have 26 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. 26 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Brock Purdy, if you take away those 2 games, would have 24 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Between the two of them, deadlocked. If you look at their QBR numbers thus far through the season, and we've laughed about this a little bit before we started, Dak Prescott, 75.6 QBR, first place in the NFL. Brock Purdy, 75.6 QBR, tied for first with Dak Prescott. They are deadlocked there. They are deadlocked in they're deadlocked in the regular stats of touchdowns and interceptions and passer rating. They're deadlocked in QBR, and they're deadlocked in record. If your wins are a quarterback stat person, which I am not, they're both 9-3. Both have a chance at getting the number 1 seed in the NFC. And I mean, like, so you were talking about if the Cowboys end up in the wild card position. If the Cowboys at home beat the Eagles in a couple weeks, they will theoretically go 14-3. They'll have won their last 11 games of the season, I want to say. They'll have gone 11-0 to end the year, and will have had either the number 1 or number 2 seed. At that point, I think it's going to be hard to deny Dak Prescott the MVP.
How do you do in the Arizona game?
I will look that up.
Think about like other Cowboys losses. I mean, losing to one of the worst teams in the league is probably also not a great thing for his MVP case as well.
Yeah, he put up a 78 passer rating, which is one of the 2 games this season he had where he had a below league average passer rating, which in the same respect, Brock Purdy has had 2 games this season where he's had a below league average passer rating. So the 2 down games for Dak Prescott, according to passer rating, were the Cardinals and the 49ers. The 2 games below a league average passer rating for Purdy were the Vikings game and the Browns game.
Okay. And, you know, you mentioned there are some other dark horse contenders out there. Can Mahomes just throw 15 touchdowns over the next 5 weeks and suddenly we're putting him back in that conversation? I don't see it this year just because the wide receiving group is just an absolute train wreck. Is something that we're kind of like learning as this season unfolds for the Chiefs. Lamar, can he make his case? Well, hey, Lamar and Purdy, they go head to head here in a couple weeks. If the Ravens finishes the number 1 seed and he's dominant the rest of the way, who knows, especially if he could get that big head to head victory against Purdy. I think head to head stuff matters. And I think that that's going to be one of those more highly watched games as we kind of like reach the season's final stretch of games. But who is your MVP? Dak, Purdy, Mahomes, anyone else that's kind of on the edge there? Would like to hear where you're leaning. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on our social medias from Juju and Kyle. Stay safe, happy, and healthy. We'll see you next time.